Hello, welcome to another session of international trade. And today we are going to discuss a very interesting theory, that is the factor price equalization theory. And this is Dr. Jubli Goswami, Assistant Professor from the Department of Economics, Lolit Chandra College. So we are going to start with a theory that is a corollary of the Hexer-Ohlin theory. The key takeaways from this discussion would be the statement of the theory of factor price equalization, the assumptions on which this theory depends, the explanation pertaining to this theory, followed by a diagrammatic explanation also using the Edgeworth box diagram. So, first of all, let us relate to what this theory says. The factor price equalization theory states that free trade tends to equalize relative factor prices among the trading countries. Let us again go through what the statement is about. That is, the free trade between countries tends to equalize relative factor prices among the trading countries. So, as I have mentioned, this theorem is a corollary of the Hexer-Ohlin theory of trade. If we go back to the Hexer-Ohlin theory of trade, we may recall that the factors of production were assumed to be immobile between countries, both in the Hexer-Ohlin theory as well as in the classical trade theories that preceded the Hexer-Ohlin theory. Now, according to this theorem, that is the factor price equalization theorem, the free trade between countries in commodities acts as a substitute of factor immobility between countries to bring about equalization in factor prices. Now, before we proceed to the explanation of this theory, let us take a look at the assumptions of this theory. As I have mentioned, that this is a corollary of the Hexer-Ohlin theory, so we assume 2 by 2, that is a two country, two commodity, two factor trade model. Suppose, let us assume that there are two countries, country A and country B, two commodities, commodity X and commodity Y, and of course, two factor, that is labor and capital. Now, as per the assumptions, the countries they are different in terms of the factor endowments. Suppose the country A is a labor abundant country and country B is a capital abundant country. Let me repeat that country A is labor abundant and B is capital abundant. This is by assumption. Now, we further assume that there is perfect competition in both the factor and the product market. There is free trade in goods, but factors are not mobile between countries. There is factor immobility between the countries, but there is free trade in commodities. There is no transportation cost, and the cost of production therefore reflects the product prices. There are constant returns to scale. Factors are qualitatively identical in the two countries. There is no difference between the factors in terms of their quality. There is no factor intensity reversal. That means if a commodity is labor intensive, it is labor intensive in both the countries. Similarly, if a commodity is capital intensive, it is capital intensive in both the commodities. So we have assumed that we are taking a two commodity model. So our commodities as per assumptions were X and Y. So let us further assume that X is labor intensive and Y is capital intensive. Then we further assume that there is not complete specialization. That means the countries, they continue to produce both the commodities, though they may specialize partially in one line of production. Then we further assume that the marginal physical products of each factor are decreasing, and further that the factor supplies are fixed. Then Let us understand the theory. As corollary to the Hexarolline theory, country A will specialize in the production and export of good X, because we have assumed that country A is capital abundant, um, and country B, suppose country A is capital abundant and country B is labor abundant, then they will specialize in that line of production in which their abundant factors are uh, used more intensively. So our assumptions were that our country was A was labor abundant and country B is capital abundant, and country X is labor intensive and country Y, commodity Y is capital intensive. So going by the assumptions that we have taken for this uh, theory, we have assumed we will proceed according to our assumptions. So going by the assumptions of the explanation that we are taking here, we are assuming country A to be labor abundant and country B to be capital abundant. And therefore, following Hexarolline theory, country A will specialize in the production and export of good X, and country Y will specialize in the production and export of good Y. So, what happens in the participating countries after trade, as trade commences? Each country will specialize in that line of production in which the abundant factor is used more intensively. So, the pressure of international demand renders the abundant factor scarce in the participating countries, and its price starts rising. Alternatively, what happens to the scarce factor? The domestic pressure falls for the scarce factor, reducing its price. And ultimately, this change continues and factor price equalization results. So, going by our assumptions again, the capital labor ratio for our country A is low, and the capital labor ratio of our country B is high, as per our assumptions. Now, as trade commences, what will happen is there is relative scarcity of labor in A. Why? Because labor will be more in demand. The abundant factor will be more in demand, because our country will specialize in the labor intensive line of production. It will produce and export that commodity which is using the labor in more intensively. So there is relative scarcity of labor in A, and the wage rate rises. Similarly, there is relative scarcity of capital in our country B, and the rate of interest rises. What happens is the capital to labor ratio in country A starts rising, and the capital to labor ratio in country B starts falling. Consequently, we will arrive at an equalization of this capital to labor ratio in both the countries, following which the capital labor ratio in country A will be equal to the capital to labor ratio in country B. And parallelly, what happens? The factor price also becomes equal in the two countries. Now, let us proceed to a diagrammatic representation of what we have understood so far. So, in this figure 1 that we are seeing, we are plotting the factor prices and the commodity prices in the two axes. As we can see, in the x-axis, we are plotting the factor prices, price ratios, and in the y-axis, we are plotting the commodity price ratios in the two countries. So, following our assumption that country A is labor abundant and country B is capital abundant, let us assume that country A is at equilibrium prior to trade at point A and country B is at equilibrium prior to trade at point B. And these points A and B, they lie on the curve RR. Now, what is curve RR? It is showing the relation between the factor price ratios and the commodity price ratios. Now, if we look at the diagram, what we are seeing that after trade commences, there is a transition from point A of country A towards point E and of country B. The equilibrium, it will change from point B as trade commences towards point E. This is marked by the arrows on the RR curve. Now, if we look intently at the figure 1, we'll see that prior to trade, the country A, which was at equilibrium at A, now because of pressure in the demand pressure on labor is being used more intensively. So what happens? The factor price ratio and the commodity price ratio, they start increasing. Both were low because country A was a labor abundant country, and following that the factor price ratio and the commodity price ratio were low at initially prior to trade. Now as trade commences, because of the pressure on labor, the demand pressure on labor, what happens is both these ratios, they start increasing and they will increase towards E. Alternatively, in country B, if we look at the figure, the factor price ratio and the commodity price ratios were high as per our assumption that country B is a capital abundant country. So these two ratios, it will start declining for country B. And what happens is that in A, there is increase in the demand for labor, and so the factor price ratio, it increases, and in country B it decreases, and ultimately they get equalized at point E. So let us further move towards a more elaborate explanation of the factor price equalization theorem using the Edgeworth box diagram. Now we are seeing on screen two figures, figure 2 and figure 3. Now these are two Edgeworth boxes that we are using to explain what is happening prior to trade and after trade commences in the two countries, our country A and country B. Now in figure 2, what we are seeing is that we are showing that of country A. Now this is more evident. Let us understand how this figure 2 is relating to country A. As we can see, the x-axis is elongated than the y-axis in figure 2. The solid line, that is the unbroken line, that is AC, this represents the contract curve. Now, this contract curve, it shows the points on this contract curve are points of Pareto optimality. And let us assume that the good x, it is the origin of good x is at A, and the origin of good y is at point C. We understand that prior to trade, there is the country is producing both the commodities, commodity X and commodity Y, and we have a set of isoquants X and Y in the diagram, and we find that prior to trade, the country A is producing at point R. Now, at point R, which is on the contract curve AC, we find that the slope AR and RC, they represent the capital labor ratio. Now, since country A is labor abundant, it has a comparative advantage on in the production of commodity X. So it will after trade commences, it will produce more of X. So the production equilibrium, it will shift from point R, let us say, to any point S on the contract curve. Now, this point S, the capital labor ratio, if we relate, we'll find that the capital labor ratio is shown by the line AS and SC in the attitude box ABCD of country A. Now, if we look at the diagram more intently, the country A, the pre-trade equilibrium is at R and the post-trade equilibrium is at S. Now, trade results in the increase in the capital labor ratio. If we look at the slope of the lines AR and AS and CR and CS, we'll find that the capital labor ratio increases in country A for both the commodities. So if we look at the diagram, we will find that the pre-trade equilibrium in R is in country A is at R and the post-trade equilibrium in country A is at S. Now, when trade commences, trade results in the increase in the capital labor ratio in both commodities, in both the lines of production, in both commodity X and commodity Y. Now, this we can detect from the slope of the lines AR and AS and CR and CS. Similarly, if we look at the lines P0, P0 and P1, P1, we'll find that the slope changes. If we look at the lines P0, P0 and P1, P1, their slope, we'll find that P1, P1 is more steep than P0, P0. So what happens is that the commodity price also changes. Finally, the factor price also changes. And finally, there is equilibrium in the factor prices, and that we can understand if we look at a figure 3 of the country B. Now, country B, we are showing the Edgeworth box again, A, B, C, D, and if we relate, then AC is the contract curve and the producer's equilibrium are shown at points A and B on this contract curve for country B. As we can see in the figure 3, that the labor axis is now short. So it means that country B is, as per our assumption, that is, it is a capital abundant country. Now what happens? That pre-trade equilibrium is at B and the post-trade equilibrium is at point A. So the trade results in the decrease in the capital labor ratio. This is clear if we compare the lines CB, CA and AA, that is, this A is on the contract curve AC and AB. So if we look at the diagram at the slopes of the lines, then it will be clear that the capital labor ratio in both commodities, they are decreasing. And there is also decrease in the factor prices. Now, if we relate to another figure, here in figure 4, what we are doing, we are comparing in one diagram the production of the two countries, country A and country B. Now, what happens? Supposing we start with A, E, F, G and the Edgeworth box A, B, C, D. As we can see that AB x-axis is the labor axis which is more elongated. That means this represents the Edgeworth box for country A. And AEFG, this represents the Edgeworth box for country B. Now, as per the earlier discussion, AC is again the contract curve and AF is also the contract curve. Now, let us start with box ABCD for country A. Now, prior to trade, the equilibrium is at R. Now, after trade, the equilibrium, it shifts to some point S on the contract curve. Now, similarly, for country B, what happens? The H-word box is A, E, F, G. And prior to trade, the equilibrium is at point T. And after trade, the equilibrium shifts to some point N on the contract curve. Why is it so? Because both the countries, they will follow that line of production in which they have a comparative advantage. That is, the labor abundant country A will produce and export more of the labor intensive good X, and alternatively country B, which is the capital abundant country, they will produce and export the capital intensive good, that is good Y. So after trade commences, what happens? The K by L ratio, which is also not only explained by the lines AR and AS or CR and CS, but it is also reflected by the angles, as we can see in the figure. Alpha 1 and alternatively B and B1. The tangents of the angles, angle alpha and angle alpha 1, and the tangents of the angles beta and beta 1. They will explain to us that after trade commences for the country A, the capital labor ratio will increase. And the capital labor ratio for country B, it will decrease, as reflected by the slopes of the lines AN, AT, and FN and FT, or the angles, angle tangent of the angle alpha 1 and tangent of the angle alpha 2, and the tangent of the angle beta 2 and the tangent of the angle beta 1. But finally, if we see for both the countries, after trade commences, the slopes will be same for both the commodities. If we see, tangent of alpha 1 holds for commodity X in both the countries, and the tangent of beta 1 will hold for commodity Y for both the countries. And therefore, the capital to labor ratio will be same for both the commodities in the two countries. And what happens? The factor prices also gets equalized. If we see that initially in country A, the P0 line, it changes to a more steeper line at point S, and alternatively the line P0 at point T, it changes to P1 at point N, which reflects the factor prices. And if we relate to the diagram, we'll find that the P1 line showing the factor prices at point N, it is parallel to the P1 line at point S in the diagram, which means that they have the same slope. So the factor prices gets equalized. So this is the factor price equalization theorem. If we relate again, that the theorem states that free trade in commodities between the countries, it will act as a substitute for the immobility of the factors. And yet, after trade commences, though the factors of production are immobile between the countries, what happens is that the factor price gets equalized. This is the factor price equalization theorem. So thank you very much.